The first thing he did was hide my shoes. All of them. Every single pair I owned, gone from the closet where I kept them, lined up neat against the wall. I came in from the garden that afternoon with dirt still on my hands. The sun was already slipping behind the trees. November was settling in over Lancaster County. The air smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke. I remember wiping my feet on the porch before stepping inside. I opened the closet door. Nothing. The floor was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe one of the children had moved them while playing. Then I felt his eyes on me. My husband was sitting at the kitchen table, coffee cup in his hand, quiet, watching. He never said a word. He didn't have to. I already understood. There are things Amish women learn without anyone teaching them directly. You learn them by watching, by listening, by noticing what happens to other women. A barefoot woman in November is not going anywhere. Not quickly, not easily, not without help. And help was the one thing nobody intended to give me. That was the first thing he did. There were 11 more things after that. Some of them took me years to understand. I am Martha. I was raised Old Order Amish. For most of my life, I believed obedience was the same thing as faith. I believed suffering quietly was a sign of strength. I believed if enough people told me something was right, then it must be. I don't believe that anymore. What the outside world doesn't see is that Amish life runs on rules that are often never written down. We called it the Ordnung. The Ordnung decided what clothes we wore, what vehicles we used, how our homes looked, how we raised our children, how we spoke, how we worshipped, even how much attention we were allowed to draw to ourselves. Most of the time, nobody handed you a list. You simply knew, or you learned after making a mistake. And one thing every baptized woman understood was this: leaving was not considered a personal choice. Leaving was considered a spiritual crisis. Something had gone wrong. Something needed to be corrected. I was 31 when I finally told my husband I could not stay. I had carried that secret for months, maybe longer. The truth is, I had been carrying pieces of it for years. Little questions, little doubts, little moments that never felt right. But Amish women are trained to push those feelings down. We call it Gelassenheit, yielding, surrendering, putting yourself last. I was good at it. Almost everyone said so. I was the wife who worked hard, the wife who didn't complain, the wife who kept her head covered and her voice soft, the wife who always smiled at church meals. But something had started breaking inside me, slowly, quietly, like ice cracking beneath snow. Nobody could see it, not even me, not at first. I remember the night I told him. The children were asleep upstairs. The house was still. Only the sound of the kerosene lamp, only the smell of supper lingering in the room. I had practiced my words for months, over and over, while hanging laundry, while kneading bread, while milking cows. I thought if I chose the perfect words, maybe everything would be okay. I was wrong. When I finally spoke, I did it gently, almost apologetically, the way Amish women are taught to deliver bad news. I told him I couldn't remain in the church. I told him my heart wasn't there anymore. I told him I needed to leave. He listened. Then he placed his coffee cup on the table, slowly, carefully, and he said 3 words. No, you're not. That was all. No anger, no shouting, no argument, just certainty. I remember looking at his face, calm, steady, and suddenly I understood something. He had been preparing for this conversation long before I ever had it. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But he wasn't surprised, not even a little. Looking back, I think he had seen the signs, the longer silences, the questions I stopped asking, the way I stared out windows, the way I lingered after church instead of rushing home. Maybe he knew before I did. A few days later, I discovered the buggy key was gone. Not lost, gone. The key always hung beside the door. Everyone in the family knew where it belonged. Now it wasn't there. I searched drawers, shelves, coat pockets. Nothing. I walked to the barn and pulled on the buggy door. Locked. The metal felt cold against my fingers. That was the moment fear started settling into my stomach. Not panic. Not yet. Something quieter. The realization that this was becoming real. I wanted to visit my sister Rebecca. Not because she agreed with me. She didn't. But she was my sister. I wanted someone familiar. Someone who had known me before I became a wife. Before I became a mother. Before I learned how much of myself could disappear. Instead, I stood in the barn, staring at that locked buggy, listening to the horses shifting in their stalls, smelling hay and leather. And I realized he had planned ahead, every step, every possibility. The next thing he did was tell the bishop. That happened quickly. In our community, information travels faster than people think, especially information about trouble. Within days, the bishop and 2 ministers came to our house. I remember hearing the buggy wheels before I saw them, the crunch of gravel, the sound of boots on the porch. I remember my hands trembling while I dried dishes. They came inside, sat down, looked at me kindly. That was the hard part. Kindness. Everything was wrapped in kindness. Nobody yelled, nobody threatened, nobody slammed a fist on the table. They spoke softly. They prayed. They quoted scripture. They told me they were worried about me. They said Satan often worked through confusion. They said faithful women sometimes lost their way. They said my husband carried a heavy burden, the burden of protecting our family, protecting my soul. I sat there listening, nodding, being respectful, doing exactly what I had been taught to do my entire life. But inside, something felt different. For the first time, I noticed nobody was asking what I believed. Nobody asked why I wanted to leave. Nobody asked what had changed. The conclusion had already been reached. I was wrong. Everyone else was right. The meeting lasted hours. When they finally left, the house felt smaller. The walls felt closer. I stood at the window and watched their buggy disappear down the lane. And for the first time in my life, I felt alone inside my own community. A week later, I learned our money was gone. Not gone completely, just gone from my reach. We never talked much about finances. Most Amish families didn't. My husband handled the accounts. That was considered normal. I sold eggs, I sold quilts, I canned vegetables. I worked from sunrise until dark, but the money always flowed through him. One morning, I asked for a little cash to buy sewing supplies. Thread, needles, small things. He looked at me and said there wasn't access anymore. I remember feeling confused, then embarrassed, then ashamed for feeling confused. I asked where the money had gone. He said he moved it. For safekeeping. That was the word. Safekeeping. I didn't argue. I just stood there, holding a basket of laundry, trying to understand how 11 years of work could suddenly stop belonging to me. There are things nobody tells Amish girls when they're growing up. Nobody tells you how quickly dependence can become a cage. Nobody tells you that trusting someone with everything means losing the ability to stand alone. I didn't know then how much harder things were about to become. I only knew the ground beneath me was starting to shift, and every person I had ever trusted seemed to be standing on the other side of that crack. The next person he spoke to was my father. That hurt more than I expected. I was taught from childhood that a father stands between his family and the world. He was a quiet man, strong hands, few words. The kind of man who could repair a wagon wheel without speaking for an hour. Growing up, I spent entire days working beside him, gathering hay, stacking firewood, walking behind horses in the fields. He wasn't affectionate. Most Amish fathers weren't. But I always believed he loved me. I still believe he did. That was what made it so difficult. A few days after Jonas visited him, I went to see my parents. The farm looked exactly the same. The white house, the wash hanging on the line, the smell of livestock drifting through the cold air. Everything familiar, everything unchanged, except me. My mother poured coffee, set pie on the table. Then she looked down at her hands. Not at me, at her hands. And she said words I still remember. "Martha, you will break your father's heart." That was all. No questions, no curiosity, no concern, only disappointment. I sat there feeling smaller with every second, like a child again, like a girl who had done something wrong. I drove home slowly that day. The horse knew the road better than I did. I remember stopping halfway down our lane, just sitting there, listening to the creak of the buggy, listening to my own breathing, trying not to cry. The next thing he did involved the children. Even now, it is difficult to talk about. Our children were my whole world. Every Amish mother understands that feeling. Your days revolve around them. Their clothes, their meals, their schooling, their scraped knees, their laughter, their prayers before bed. Everything. One morning, Jonas told me he was taking them to visit his mother. Nothing unusual about that. Families visit each other often. I kissed each child goodbye, watched the buggy disappear. Then I waited, and waited, and waited. The first day passed, then the second. No children came home. No explanation came either. The house became unbearably quiet. I could hear every clock, every floorboard, every gust of wind outside. Their empty beds upstairs felt like a message, a warning. For the first time, I understood completely. The children were not separate from this situation. They were part of it. Maybe not intentionally, maybe not cruelly, but they were. Everyone knew they were the thing I loved most, and everyone knew that love could be used against me. That realization changed something inside me. Not all at once, slowly, but permanently. Soon after that, my sister Rebecca arrived. She said she was there to help, and maybe she believed that. I think she did. I don't blame her now. Back then, though, it felt different. She followed me everywhere, not obviously, not aggressively, just constantly. If I worked in the garden, she came too. If I baked bread, she sat nearby. If I folded laundry, she found a reason to stay in the room. At night, I heard quiet conversations between her and Jonas, whispers after everyone else was asleep. I never knew exactly what was said. I only knew how it felt. I felt watched, measured, observed, like every thought had become suspicious, like every silence needed reporting. One afternoon, I was peeling potatoes. Just potatoes, nothing more. Rebecca sat across from me, knitting, talking about faith, talking about obedience, talking about how hard life could be when people fought God's plan. I looked down at those potatoes, at my hands, at the knife moving through the skin, and suddenly I realized nobody in that room was talking to me. They were talking to the version of me they wanted back, the obedient version, the quiet version, the version that never asked questions, the version that stayed. A few weeks later, I learned something else, something that shook me deeply. Months before all this began, I had met an Englishwoman at a farmer's market. Only once. We spoke for maybe 10 minutes. She was kind. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. But before leaving, she handed me an address. She said if I ever needed help, I could write. I kept that address hidden. Eventually, I sent a letter. Then I waited. No response. Weeks passed. Then months. I assumed she never answered. I assumed she forgot. After I left the Amish community, I learned the truth. She had written back. Twice. Both letters arrived. Both letters were taken before I ever saw them. When I learned that, I sat in silence for a very long time. Because it wasn't only about the letters. It was about knowing that even my hope had been intercepted. Even my attempts to reach beyond the community had been controlled. There are things that leave marks you cannot see. That was one of them. Around that same time, Jonas changed in another way. He became polite, painfully polite, almost formal. He greeted me kindly, thanked me for meals, asked simple questions. Everything sounded normal, but something was missing. Connection, warmth, recognition. He stopped looking at me the way husbands look at wives, stopped sitting beside me, stopped sharing pieces of himself. It was like living with a stranger who knew everything about me. And for a woman raised to believe her worth came from being a good wife, that distance felt devastating. I began to disappear inside my own house. Then came Anna, the deacon's wife. She was older, respected, gentle, the kind of woman everyone trusted. She visited often, always with a smile, always with knitting in her lap. She never pressured me directly. That wasn't her method. Instead, she told stories. Stories about women who stayed, women who struggled but remained faithful, women who endured. Then she told other stories. Stories about women who left, women who lost everything, women who became lonely, women who regretted their choices. Hour after hour, day after day. 2 futures, only 2. Stay and belong, leave and suffer. I remember realizing something important. Nobody was trying to understand me. They were trying to return me to my place. The final turning point came months later. By then, I was exhausted, emotionally, spiritually, physically. Every conversation felt like a battle. Every day felt heavy. Then, one evening, Jonas apologized. At least, that is what I thought. We sat at supper. The children were laughing. The room felt almost normal. He looked at me and said he was sorry. Sorry for being hard. Sorry for making things difficult. Sorry for the pain. Then he said he loved me. For a moment, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. Maybe that was my mistake. Maybe it was simply hope. I cried. For the first time in months, I felt relief. I thought we had finally found each other again. I thought the worst was over. 2 days later, I discovered a letter. It was sitting unfinished on his desk. A letter intended for the bishop. As I read it, my hands started shaking. Every private conversation, every vulnerable moment, every fear I had shared after his apology, everything was written down, recorded, reported, collected. That was the moment everything became clear. The apology wasn't reconciliation, it was strategy, another tool, another attempt to manage me, control me, bring me back into line. And once I saw that, I could never unsee it. 6 weeks later, I left. I won't describe how. Some paths still belong to women who need them. Some doors should remain open. I will only say that I left carrying very little. A small bag, a few precious things, and more fear than I had ever felt in my life. The shunning came quickly, what we call Meidung. Many people outside the Amish world struggle to understand it. I understand why. It is difficult to imagine. Letters returned unopened. Family members looking away. Conversations ending before they begin. People who once shared every holiday suddenly acting as if you no longer exist. My parents stopped answering. My sisters disappeared from my life. People I had known since childhood became strangers overnight. The silence was overwhelming. But eventually something happened. I learned new words. Words I had never heard growing up. One of those words was control. Another was coercion. Another was abuse. The first time a therapist explained those ideas to me, I cried. Not because it was shocking, because it was familiar. For the first time in my life, someone gave language to experiences I had carried alone. I want to be careful when I say this. Not every Amish husband is cruel. Not every Amish marriage is unhappy. That would not be true. I knew kind men. I knew loving families. I knew marriages built on genuine affection. But I also know this. The system gives enormous power to anyone determined to use it. And when an entire community believes that controlling someone is an act of love, it becomes very difficult for that person to recognize what is happening. I didn't know then what I know now. I didn't know freedom could feel so frightening. I didn't know loneliness could sit beside relief. I didn't know grief and healing could happen at the same time. But they can. Sometimes I still think about that closet, the empty floor, the missing shoes. At the time, it seems like a small thing. Now I understand what it really was. A message. You cannot leave. At least, that was the message he intended. But he was wrong, because eventually I did leave. And eventually I learned something the Ordnung never taught me. A person does not stop belonging to herself simply because everyone around her says she does. That truth cost me almost everything, but I would still choose it again. This is my story. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more real Amish experiences no one else is telling.